After the episode on the Constellation class, I was sure we were done with US military shipbuilding as a topic for the year. And after taking an existing European frigate, redesigning it partly to add more missile cells, only to eventually cancel and replace it with a converted Coast Guard cutter that doesn't have any missile cells, you might have expected the US Navy was now going to buckle down and focus on the basics. Maybe find a way to get more proven hulls in the water, to field more VLS cells, and double down on the effort to design a next-generation replacement for the venerable Arleigh-Burke destroyers that are starting to show their age. Probably less common on everyone's bingo cards was the announcement of a new class of railgun-toting battleship. In the 19th and early 20th century, the big gun battleship had been the accepted barometer of international naval power. Then, amidst a flurry of technological changes spurred on by the Second World War, they started to disappear. Carriers and missile systems represented both new threats to the conventional battleship, but also new military alternatives. And by the early 1990s, the battleships as a class passed into history. Now, though, it seems like there might be a plan of sorts in Washington to bring the battleships back, with the US Secretary of the Navy showing off plans for the new USS Defiant, first of the so-called Trump-class guided missile battleships, toting everything from VLS cells, hypersonics and lasers to a forward-mounted 32-megajoule railgun. Because apparently if your shipyards are already struggling to turn out enough basic destroyers to keep up in a building race with a peer competitor, the clear answer is to ask them to start turning out 35,000-ton supercombatants packed with technology that, strictly speaking, doesn't exist yet. And so today, we're going to look at what we know so far about what might be the largest US Navy surface combatant constructed since the Second World War, including its announced features, some of the more interesting elements of the apparent proposed design, as well as some of the most obvious and pressing questions, like, will this potentially work? What are the risks? How does the ship compare on paper to some of the possible alternatives? And what the return of the battleship could actually mean for an already overstretched US shipbuilding sector. To do that, I'll start by setting some context. Why did nations start building big gun battleships? And why did they stop? Then we'll look at what we've seen so far of the USS Defiant. We'll then touch on some of the most high-risk elements and interesting technologies, especially the railgun system the battleship is meant to integrate, and then ask what going ahead with these ships might mean for the future of US military shipbuilding, what we're potentially likely to see happen next, and then, as a fun twist in the end, if this isn't the ideal way to build a 21st century battleship, how you might potentially do it instead. Before we jump into it though, let me welcome back a sponsor. And so let me welcome back long-term sponsors of the channel, Private Internet Access. For better or worse, as we head into 2026, the reality is that while our networks and access to them might be increasingly global, your digital terrain can still very much be driven by where you are. And so if you're looking to exercise more control or minimise risk in that digital space, you might struggle to find a silver bullet. Instead, much like designers might still put countermeasures or jammers on a jet that's designed not to be detected in the first place, you might instead want to layer different tools and practices together. Maintain strong passwords, be careful where you browse and what you click, watch out for the physical security of your device, what networks you connect to, and if you're like me, you might also want to use a VPN. What these can allow you to do pretty much with a click is reroute internet traffic and change your publicly perceived IP address. PIA gives you access to servers across 91 countries and 50 US states, meaning I was able to travel pretty extensively throughout the year, but as far as my IP was concerned, I barely left Australia or New Zealand, with the occasional trip over to Canada. Private Internet Access also advertises compatibility with a range of streaming services, a no-logs policy, and helpfully in an era where people often have more than one device on the go, they actually allow you to cover an unlimited number of your devices with a single subscription. So if you're interested, there will be a link in the description offering an 83% discount on a 2-year subscription, plus 4 additional bonus months with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And so, with my thanks to Private Internet Access as always, let's get back to it. Okay, let's start by talking rise and fall of the big gun battleship, noting this is a very truncated version of the story, coming very much from my requirements-focused perspective. The core of what you would traditionally think of as the battleship design dates back to an era where the primary offensive weapon for ships at sea were long-range artillery guns. In terms of the caliber of those guns and the degree of armed protection, battleships were at the top of the surface combatant hierarchy. In the 19th and early 20th century, most designs out there were mixed battery battleships or pre-dreadnoughts, with the general debate raging for many years of whether a battleship would be better off having fewer, larger, slower-firing main guns or a larger battery of faster-firing small ones. Some of the designs, like Macassar on the right there, might seem relatively reasonable to the modern eye, while others, like this majestic example of French pre-dreadnought design, probably look like something you'd expect a particularly mangled AI to come up with. Eventually though, especially based on observations from the Russo-Japanese War, designers come to a conclusion that realistically, in a big naval fight, all of those little guns don't really matter. They don't have the range, they don't have the hitting power, they have to fire on a higher trajectory, they complicate spotting the splashes for your big guns, which are the ones you really want to do the damage. And so the Brits are the first to pull a trigger on a battleship that moves over to an all-big gun configuration. This was HMS Dreadnought, commissioned 1906, which moved from the standard 4 12-inch guns per battleship to a casual 10, although it did retain 27 3-inch guns as a significant secondary battery. With the exception of a few contrarians, cough France cough, just about everyone rushed to copy and improve on the basics of Dreadnought's design, focusing on battleships that would steadily get larger, better protected, and which were focused around mounting a significant main battery of large caliber guns. The escalation in armour tonnage and firepower was in some ways frankly breathtaking. In 1906, Dreadnought mounted 10 12-inch guns on an 18,000-ton platform. In 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy would commission the first Yamato-class battleship, carrying 9 18.1-inch guns on a roughly 70,000-ton platform. The lead-up to World War II arguably represented the zenith of conventional battleship design, with the Americans and Japanese going in slightly different directions. With the Yamato class, the Japanese would build biggest, both in terms of displacement and caliber of the main guns. With the Iowa class, meanwhile, the Americans really pushed the concept of the fast battleship. Unlike a lot of other battleships out there, the Iowas can actually keep up with the aircraft carriers of the day. And through the war, they would steadily see their roles shift. Battleships could still be used as surface combatants against other warships, but they were also seen as relevant for a lot of other duties. Shore bombardment, for example, where 16-inch shells tend to make a heck of an impression on a lot of ground targets. The Americans also figured out that, hey, we've got these big ships with a lot of space and crew on them, how about we bolt a bunch of anti-aircraft guns to them? And so by the end of World War II, an Iowa-class battleship didn't just have its main guns, it had 20 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, 80 40mm Bofors guns, and about 50 20mm cannon. If you wanted a mobile flak wall that could potentially protect the rest of a task group, the battleships were a decent option. After World War II, though, battleships globally would pretty rapidly start to fade away. What you're looking at on the right there is, to date, the last example of a battleship built anywhere in the world, HMS Vanguard, commissioned in 1946 and then decommissioned June 1960. So the battleships were clearly dying, but why? The simple answer is that the aircraft carrier became the new de facto capital ship of choice, and there was no place in the new air-power-driven order for the old battleships. From a procurement perspective, I'd argue that is part of it, but only part of it. Yes, battleships were clearly increasingly vulnerable, and their armour protection was no longer enough to save them. Aircraft had proven to be a significant threat to battleships during the Second World War, and with the advent of the heavy anti-ship missile, you can see an example of a Soviet AS-1 on the right there, no amount of armour was realistically going to be enough. The meta quickly shifted towards ships that were lightly armoured, which obviously meant you no longer needed a very large ship to carry said slabs of armour. Torpedoes were also getting better and increasingly lethal, which helped confirm that move away from the original battleship philosophy. Just as the armoured knight had become less relevant and less efficient as gunpowder appeared and improved, naval armour was now less worth the cost in an era of increasingly modern weapons. But as is so often the case, this was also just about economics and trade-offs. The battleships that most nations ended the war with in inventory were generally monstrously expensive to run and extremely crew-intensive. In its World War II configuration, an Iowa-class battleship might have about 2,700 crew, roughly the same as a modern Ford-class aircraft carrier, twice the displacement, with significantly more power projection capacity. Automation and upgrades in the 1980s did help cut that down to about 1,800, but that still meant a Navy might be able to crew more than 5 modern missile destroyers for the same headcount as a single modernised battleship. And because of the way offensive technology had moved on, the destroyers and the carriers were just a better deal. Even before the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers came around, the US Navy's Iowas were coexisting with the Spruance-class destroyers. The upgraded battleship had a crew of about 1,800 and carried 48 missiles, 32 Tomahawks and 16 Harpoons. The Spruance had a crew a tiny fraction of the size, but could mount a 61-cell Mark 41 VLS, 2 quadruple Harpoon missile launchers, and an 8-cell Sea Sparrow launcher for good measure. Yes, if you wanted specifically to drop naval gunfire on something, the Iowa still had the advantage, but for just about everything else, something like the Spruance was a much better deal. There were multiple proposals to refit the old battleships to be more suitable for modern requirements. One of my favourites, although not a particularly practical one, was what you can see on the top right there, the battle carrier concept that would have fit a small flight deck to the back of an Iowa. The problem with all of these ideas, including others that would have ripped out the guns and replaced them with a bunch of missile systems, is that really it was hard to make them competitive with just building a new purpose-built ship. Why would you want a converted World War II battleship with half a flight deck when you could build a new actual carrier? Why would you want an expensive refit process to take an old battle wagon and pack it full of VLS when you can just build a modern ship packed full of VLS? Eventually, in the peace dividend environment, it wasn't just technology, but the bean counters that finally killed the battleship. And so until this most recent development, short of an alien invasion, it seemed unlikely we'd ever see their kind reactivated again. Until earlier this week, we saw the announcement of something unexpected. This is the USS Defiant, a next-generation warship that marks the transition from peace dividend-centric designs to those more focused on direct peer-on-peer warfare. This is also the USS Defiant, and since the wizards over at DARPA apparently haven't yet got the hang of warp coils or pulse phasers, this is apparently the concept the US Navy is interested in and which we're going to have to talk about today. Soon after the press conference where these things were announced, I got a deluge of messages that basically boiled down to, hey mate, you've got to review the design for this new Trump-class battleship, which I think is an interesting question, but also potentially jumping the gun. Because depending on how you look at it, it might be open to argue whether or not this thing is a battleship, whether it's actually a design, and the jury might even be out when it comes to the name. By modern convention, US Navy warship classes are named after the lead vessel of the class. The first Arleigh Burke built was the USS Arleigh Burke, the first Ticonderoga, the USS Ticonderoga. Obviously, rules can be changed, but by convention, that would make this a design for a Defiant-class guided missile battleship, not a Trump-class. And even then, design is probably a bit too generous a word. What we've seen so far is much closer to being a concept for a new ship as opposed to a detailed design of one. We have concept art and some stated characteristics, but no evidence that the years of effort necessary have gone into the process of taking those concepts and turning them into something you could hand over to a shipyard and say, build this. A major piece of evidence here is that in budgetary terms, the Defiant appears to have basically come out of nowhere. There hasn't been funding for internal design work or a design competition between various shipbuilding firms or even a pre-design competition. With the Constellation class, for example, various companies were given some money ahead of the competition to basically refine their designs so they could put their best foot forward in the competition. With Defiant, we haven't seen anything like that, nor the kind of budget lines we've seen for other potential future US ships and submarines like SSNX or DDGX that have received multiple millions of dollars over a protracted period of time. Both of those examples are still believed to be pre-design, despite all of the investment that's taken place so far. So it would seem deeply unlikely to me that the US Navy ship design establishment has been able to pull together a detailed design for a new battleship in a matter of weeks or months, on a massively truncated timescale and using the budgetary equivalent of a fiver someone found down the back of a couch. I bring all of that up for two main reasons. The first is to set expectations around how quickly you might expect to see these things in the water, even if the US decides to go full steam ahead from here out. Realistically, given you're talking about the largest US surface combatant since World War II, and probably the most complex it's ever built, you'd hope the US Navy might want to spend a little bit of time making sure the design is right before it starts cranking the things out. And so realistically, I'd expect the design would still be several years away, and the construction of the first vessel well out into the next decade. The other reason to bring it up is to explain why I don't think we need to spend the next 30 minutes poking holes at the images that have been released so far. As a concept, a final design, if there ever is a final design, could potentially be very, very different. And so I don't think it's necessary to focus overly much on some of the more interesting elements of the design. For example, the ship has a number of defensive weapon systems intended to protect it against things like incoming missiles. That includes high-energy lasers and rolling airframe missiles that all appear to be concentrated here, with their firing arcs consequently greatly constrained. If you look at these contemporary surface combatants, I've got a Chinese Type 55 on top and an older Arleigh Burke on the bottom, you'll see a very similar arrangement for the circle defensive systems. Both of these ships have a rotary cannon capable of shooting down missiles up front, and then the Burke has another phalanx system aft, while the Chinese has a missile defense system instead. Either way, there's at least one mount providing coverage fore and aft, and those mounts are capable of pivoting to engage threats incoming from port or starboard. On the Defiant, the only way for those lasers and launchers to intercept a threat coming from the front would be to shoot through the bridge or the radar. Fine if an enemy jet conveniently places itself directly in your firing line, but deeply unhelpful if your opponent isn't kind enough to direct their threats towards your covered arcs. Like I said though, we're talking about a concept, not a design. And so I think it's probably more valuable to focus on the types of systems and capabilities they've said they want this platform to have, and what that tells us about what it's meant to be able to do. Some information was contained in the announcement, although not all of it militarily relevant. The Navy Secretary, for example, said that these would be the best-looking warships anywhere in the world, which is not the kind of thing I feel I'm well-equipped to judge, nor something I'd normally prioritise in an evaluation. More useful to us is potential hard data about the concept. In that respect, the US government published two very useful pieces of information for us. This is a basic weapons and major systems diagram, marking out some of the major features of the ship, including its primary weapon systems, the type of propulsion system, and the selected radar. Note, I believe there is a typo in this version which I pulled from Goldenfleet.navy.mil. It says the ship is meant to mount 28 Mark 41 vertical launch system cells. I believe the correct number is actually 128. The stat block below says 128, and that would make a lot more sense for a ship this size. So I'm going to proceed on the basis that it is 128, and this will likely be corrected by the time the video goes live. But in any case, even if we don't know exactly what the ship is going to look like, we do still have some useful information about the concept. We know its intended dimensions, its displacement, its primary weapon systems, its method of propulsion, how many it's proposed to potentially build, what its primary missions might be, and hopefully enough information to answer the next question. Based on what we've been given so far, is the Defiant actually a battleship? And look, realistically, there's two main ways to answer that question. The first is to admit that when it comes to modern warship designs, it's basically a state of anarchy. The designations can vary to the point of near meaninglessness from navy to navy, and realistically, no one's going to stop you identifying your warship as basically whatever you want. The Germans are reportedly planning to build a new family of large surface combatants with the same number of VLS cells as an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, equivalent sensors to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, an Aegis-style combat system, and an equivalent displacement to an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Meaning, of course, this is going to be a frigate. The Chinese Type 55 has roughly the same VLS count as a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, a lot of the same mission as a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and more displacement than a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and so of course is a destroyer, which will probably feel right at home facing off against their competitor Japanese destroyers, right as soon as the latter finish launching their F-35s. You know, the way destroyers do. The point is, in 2025, ship classifications often have about as much meaning as job titles. And so if the US Navy wants to call this thing a battleship, no one's going to stop them, especially if that railgun the thing is meant to mount becomes operational. But if the question is instead, does this thing meet the traditional definition of a battleship, things become a bit murkier. In terms of dimensions, it absolutely fits. I've got the statistics for the Defiant on the right there compared to the old Iowa-class battleships. And as you can see, in terms of length and beam, if you take the middle of the estimates for the Defiant, they are remarkably close to the Iowa. Like, freakishly close to the point where you wonder whether or not it was an accident. Iowa had a beam of about 108 feet. Defiant is meant to be between 105 and 115. Iowa, from memory, was somewhere between 860 and 890 feet in length. Defiant, we're told, is meant to be between 840 and 880. The draft and the displacement are obviously going to be lower because the ship's being made out of modern materials and isn't being covered in slabs of armour like the World War II equivalent, but it's still going to displace more than a lot of historical battleships, and even in terms of speed, be roughly equivalent to the Iowa. They're quoting a speed of at least 30 knots for Defiant. Iowa could manage 33, or 35 plus at a light load. From there, though, the similarities start to fall away. One of the defining features of battleship design was a main battery of large caliber guns. Their mission tended to be intrinsically linked to the usage of those large caliber guns, and they also tended to be very heavily armoured. The stats suggest it has relatively little armour, and while it does have some gun systems, 2 5-inches, 4 30mm, and 1 forward-facing railgun, as you can see from the stat block, those are all considered to be part of the battleship's secondary battery. Its primary offensive firepower is all tied up in missiles. So is the Defiant a battleship in the traditional sense of the old Iowas, Yamatos, Bismarcks, or KG-5s? I'd argue no. But if that's the case, at its core, what actually is it? Some in the media have instead made comparisons between the Defiant and a concept known as the arsenal ship. Quote, "The new battleship is reminiscent of the Navy's 1996 plan for what it termed the arsenal ship, which at nearly 40,000 tons displacement would have been even bigger than the projected Trump class. It too boasted a very large number of missile tubes for Tomahawk and other missiles, and was meant to supplement carrier firepower or operate independently." End quote. Okay, so going by that, this might be an arsenal ship, where basically the idea was to take a large hull, pack it full of lots and lots and lots of missiles, and turn it into a kind of massive firepower dispenser to support the rest of the fleet. The US Navy doesn't use the arsenal ship terminology for Defiant. They've given it the BBG designation, Guided Missile Battleship, to differentiate it from the old BBs, the battleships. My problem with that, just looking at the stat block though, is that if this is meant to be a missile-carrying ship, it's kind of shit at carrying missiles. If we compare the stat block for the Defiant to the Ticonderoga-class cruisers that the United States is working towards retiring, I think the basic point comes through relatively well. The Ticonderoga class has 122 Mark 41 VLS cells and carries an additional 8 Harpoon anti-ship missiles on a roughly 10,000 ton displacement. The Defiant adds a mighty 6 additional VLS cells, but drops the 8 anti-ship missile box launchers, but does include 12 additional conventional prompt strike missiles, which is the hypersonic weapon also fired by the Army's Dark Eagle. Now, we know from some of the documents that have come out about another US ship design, DDGX, that the intention there is to be able to fit 12 conventional prompt strike missiles into the same area that would otherwise pack 32 normal VLS. So if we assign all these cells points values, where one Mark 41 launcher is worth 1 point, and 12 CPS launchers are worth 32 points, because you could otherwise fit 32 VLS in the same space, then you end up with the Ticonderoga carrying 130 points of missiles and the Defiant carrying 160. But, in terms of displacement, Defiant is roughly 3.5 times the size of the Tycho. Expressed another way, for every missile point carried on the Ticonderoga, there's 77 tons of ship. On the Defiant, there's closer to 219. The purpose of an arsenal ship is to efficiently carry shit tons of missiles. But by these release figures, Defiant is actually far less efficient at doing that than existing US designs. So if Defiant isn't using all of that displacement, all of that volume to be the best guided missile ship possible, if it isn't an arsenal ship or a deadly focused guided missile battleship, what is it? And the best answer so far appears to be a bit of everything. It's got a little bit of amphib in it, with a massive landing pad and aviation facilities, reportedly capable of supporting not just helicopters, but also the V-22 Osprey. It's part command ship, with a full C4I suite for embarked higher-ranked officers. It's a secondary nuclear weapon delivery platform, reportedly capable of firing new nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. It's a host platform for a variety of high-energy systems, including 4 laser dazzlers, 2 300 to 600 kilowatt lasers, as well as a 32 megajoule forward-mounted railgun. But despite that, it apparently doesn't use the kind of power plants you might expect to see on an electrically intensive design. For example, the integrated electric system of the Zumwalt or a nuclear power plant, and instead apparently relies on a more traditional combination of gas turbines and diesel. It's also apparently part launch platform for an extremely long-range hypersonic weapon capable of express delivery from London to Moscow, while also being part gunship in a traditional sense, mounting 2 5-inches and the aforementioned railgun, which, rather than being focused on borderline intercontinental engagements, would be more useful if the battleship was willing to get significantly closer to its targets. And given that it's inarguably one of this ship's most unique proposed features, I think that railgun deserves a little bit of focus. Without getting too much into the science of the things, because they probably deserve their own episode, truth be told, railguns differ from normal ones in that instead of propelling something by detonating propellant behind it, you're instead using electricity and magnetic rails to hurl it forward. In theory, that gives them a range of potential benefits: more compact ammunition because you don't need the propellant, much higher muzzle velocities, and as a result, railguns have a long and proven combat history in science fiction. The Mac cannons of Halo, the railguns of The Expanse, the weapons of ships in the Mass Effect universe. If you're in a fictional universe and you want a hypervelocity hole puncher, accept no substitutes. But in the real world, railguns are still much earlier in their developmental journey, to the point where the navalized 32 megajoule system the Defiant is meant to mount doesn't really exist, or at least not as a current proven deployable weapon system. After years of development work and about $500 million spent, the US Navy actually more or less shelved its railgun program back in 2021. There's a lot that went into that, including funding competition with other missile-based weapon systems, but a lot of it came down to intrinsic challenge of this kind of weapon. They're energy and cooling intensive. Barrel life was a significant problem. And then, to top it all off, railguns, at least current railguns, tend to really struggle when it comes to rate of fire. The US Navy was reportedly aiming for a rate of fire of about 10 shots per minute, and in land-based tests were able to achieve about half that. Even though the US Navy took its foot off the pedal when it comes to railguns, however, doesn't mean everyone else did. General Atomics pushed on with their development efforts, and so too did Japan. They've actually gotten to the point of installing a lower-powered prototype railgun on a ship and demonstrating test shots, with a significant part of the Japanese focus being on the use of naval railguns, not so much for direct attacks against enemy shipping, although that's obviously a capability of interest, but instead as a type of missile defense system. General Atomics is now pitching a range of railgun systems up to and including a 32 megajoule one, and so potentially a match for what this battleship is meant to carry. In choosing to bet big on the railgun though, there are a couple of risks and potential limitations. Some of the technical and material science challenges might be solved, but there's no guarantee they will be, and so you might risk betting a lot of ship volume and effort on the performance of a weapon system that's still very much unknown. Even if you get the system to work as intended, there are still questions around its lethality and its economic efficiency. Railguns can pack a lot of kinetic energy, but they're essentially hole punchers. You can see that from the image in the Japanese test. So against a lot of target types, they might not have the same destructive effect as you might imagine, given the amount of energy involved. They also offer the prospect of potentially using much cheaper ammunition against a lot of targets compared to a missile system or complex hypervelocity guided shells. But even there are still questions about projectile cost, especially if they have to be guided or specialised for various targets, and how they'll measure up against slower but potentially cheap and long-range alternatives. For example, long-range attack drones or cheap miniaturised cruise missiles. But regardless of how the comparison shakes out, I think the railgun is in some ways symbolic of some of the major risks the US would be taking on by committing heavily to this platform. Immature technology, the risk of picking the wrong doctrinal idea, and then perhaps the big one, defence economics and industrial challenges. The technology risk is simple. Defiant relies on a number of technologies and systems that don't currently exist. And so if those systems, like the lasers or railguns, aren't ready on time or don't perform as planned, you run the risk of the program being delayed, being cancelled, or, like the Zumwalt class with their advanced gun systems, being built, at least in some small numbers, but without the tools necessary to do the mission they were originally intended to do. There's also the risk that with the benefit of hindsight, it turns out to be the wrong technology. In an arms build-up scenario, it's hard to fall behind doing basically the same thing as everyone else, but trying to do it a bit better. More and better missiles, more powerful sensors, improved kill chains. Those are understood metrics of naval competition. Going with something very different, like a pivot towards the railgun, is more of a high-risk strategy. If it works and turns out to be super effective and efficient, you might get more combat power for your investment than everyone else. But if you end up backing a dud, you might end up even further behind. And that's assuming that you could even build these things in the first place, which starts to get into perhaps the two greatest challenges that I think something like the Defiant might face in a US context: the industrial challenge of making them and the comparative efficiency versus other platforms. Compared to all the other surface combatants the United States has been building through the entirety of the Cold War and post-Cold War period, Defiant is massive. All else being equal, they're just going to be more demanding in terms of resources, in terms of workforce, and in terms of infrastructure than smaller destroyer and cruiser designs. And I'd expect that at least some of the US dry dock facilities, for example, that are focused on destroyer construction and maintenance, won't be able to support the larger ships. That then raises a question. Are you going to improve and upgrade those facilities? Are you going to go to the facilities that can handle larger ships, like the amphibs and the carriers, and bump some of them out of the production queue? And how are you going to avoid the switch over to a ship this size? Effectively kneecapping what's left of the United States effort to keep up with a country like China when it comes to turning out large surface combatants. Because if you start looking at the ship from a defence economics problem in the context of US competition with China, there's a risk the Defiant program becomes a major relative advantage for Beijing. Let me explain what I mean. Let's assume, I think safely, that what Washington DC wants is ideally for the United States Navy to be as strong as possible compared to relevant competitors, in particular, the People's Liberation Army Navy. The US has a number of incumbency advantages there in terms of technology and starting with a much larger fleet, but it also has a disadvantage, a lot less shipbuilding capacity. And so over time, if the US wants to shift the comparative balance more in its favour, or at least slow the rate at which it shifts towards Beijing, the US needs to be as efficient as possible with the shipbuilding capacity and resources it does have. To help assess various ship options against that goal, we need metrics, both for offensive capability and also resource intensiveness. And to keep this relatively simple, I'm going to focus on just 3 in each category. For offensive capability, we care about sensors, we care about VLS capacity, and to a lesser extent, defensive weapon systems. Sensors are critical both offensively and defensively. You need to be able to find your opponent, preferably get the first shot off, and also see incoming threats. Fortunately for us, there's a lot of comparability between US large surface combatants as the US increasingly standardizes on the SPY-6 radar, which moves our focus to missile count. The reason to focus on missile capacity is because in the context of naval warfare, for a lot of warships, your missiles are your offensive option, your defensive option, and your mission all rolled into one. Unlike armies, ships can't really dig in, your concealment options are limited unless you're something like a submarine or a stealth vessel, and the weapons are generally so powerful that no one's really packing much in the way of armour. So a lot of your offensive and defensive options are going to be active in nature, a lot of them are tied to those missile cells, and if you don't have enough, you might just die. If you're an air and missile defense destroyer and you detect ballistic missiles coming after the carrier you're meant to protect, you better hope you have enough interceptors in those cells to successfully shoot them down. If you get a mission to attack ground targets, you better hope that you have enough cruise missiles packed. In a lot of naval combat models, having more cells available in the right place at the right time just gives you a huge advantage and more flexibility compared to your opponent. If the other guy has 16 cells and you have 64, you can probably afford to pack enough interceptors to shoot down all of the offensive missiles he might have, enough offensive missiles of your own to destroy him in turn, and still have enough left over to do other missions, like land attack or ballistic missile defense. That goes some way towards explaining why we've seen multiple navies around the world push to find new ways to add far more VLS cells to their fleet, and also, where possible, distribute that lethality across multiple platforms. If I have 300 missile cells spread across a pair of manned ships and a couple of drones, and you have 300 cells on a single ship, then I only have to successfully engage and destroy a single target in order to take all of your firepower offline, which might be worth me using some very expensive munitions like hypersonics or ballistic missiles in order to do, while you have to solve that same kill chain problem against multiple targets in order to get the same effect, meaning it might not be as efficient for you to use those very high-end options. Summary, in a peer-on-peer conflict scenario, all else being equal, a navy is probably going to want to have as many missiles and as many launch cells as possible. And because resources are inherently limited, it's going to want to field those missiles and cells as efficiently as possible. To measure resource efficiency, there's at least 3 metrics you might want to look at. The first is very simple, although the data isn't always available, and that's the procurement cost of the ship. If you only have so many shipbuilding dollars available, you want to get the best possible bang for your buck. Another good proxy measure is tonnage, especially when you don't have good procurement cost data. All else being equal, a bigger ship of the same type is probably going to cost more than a smaller one. You need more material, you need more labour, and so you'll see ship tonnage pop up in a lot of cost prediction models. And then finally, you might also want to look at crew count. For a lot of navies, crew is both a major ongoing cost and also a resource bottleneck. Not everyone wants to go to sea for a living, and there's an even smaller subset who want to risk getting shot at while doing so. And so even if you can produce the ships, if you can't recruit the crew to operate them, until ChatGPT gets the inevitable naval warfare plugin, you're probably not going to get much combat power out of it. If those were our rough metrics then, how would something like the IISS Defiant measure up against some of the potential investment alternatives? Essentially, if you ploughed a roughly even amount of resources into different designs, what would each of those options give you? And here, for illustrative purposes, I've decided to go with 4 comparators. An existing US design, the Flight 3 Arleigh destroyer, another existing US design, the Zumwalt-class destroyers, a current Chinese design, the Type 55, which retired US Navy Captain Chris Carlson has described as, depending on your criteria, either the best or second best surface combatant in the world at the moment. And then finally, a concept for a future US design, the DDGX, which is nominally meant to replace the old Ticonderoga-class cruisers and some of the older Burkes. Having picked our competitors, I then needed to work out a rough ratio for the comparisons. And looking at tonnage, crew count, and what we know about procurement cost, the comparative ratios I've decided to go with here are between 3 Burkes in the Defiant, 3 Type 55s in the Defiant, or a 2-to-1 ratio if you're talking about the Zumwalts or DDGX. In terms of dollar cost, the lowest cost guesstimate I could find for the Defiant comes from the CSIS, who came up with a very rough figure ignoring R&D costs and a premium for the first ship of about $9.1 billion per hull. That would make a Defiant slightly more expensive than a pair of DDGXs to use the CBO's cost estimate, a bit cheaper than a pair of Zumwalts, which inflation adjusted pushed past the $10 billion mark, and significantly more expensive than even a trio of Burkes, which are currently pushing north of $2 billion per. In terms of displacement, if we take the middle estimate from the stat block, all of our options are fairly closely aligned, with the Defiant a little bit on the heavier side. It would displace slightly less than 3 of the Chinese cruisers, but thousands of tons more than 3 Burkes, 2 Zumwalts, or 2 copies of the DDGX. In terms of crew, again to take the middle estimate, it would be less intensive than the Type 55s or the trio of Burkes, and several times more crew intensive than the highly automated Zumwalts. For the DDGX, we haven't got anything like a firm crew number announced yet, and so while the stated intention is to employ automation on the ship to try and control crew size, I played it conservative here and used the Burke crew numbers as a baseline. Basically, across the board then, our hypothetical Defiant seems to be about 2 to 3 times as resource intensive as our comparison ships. And yet, the amount of missile firepower and critical systems aboard doesn't really seem to match that. The single Defiant or a pair of next-gen destroyers have the same number of VLS cells, 128. A pair of Zumwalts have 160. A trio of Burkes more than twice as many as the Battleship, 288. And a trio of Type 55s, 336. So 3 times the sensor sets and roughly 2.6 times the missiles, on very roughly the same displacement. What the Defiant does have going for it, compared to the Burkes and the Chinese Type 55s, is that 12-pack of conventional prompt strike hypersonic weapons. But the 2 sci-fi US destroyer designs are also meant to be able to include that 12-pack on each ship. So overall, the DDGX and Zumwalt options end up having twice the hypersonic firepower. As an aside here, the Chinese deciding not to put full-size, long-range hypersonic weapons on their ships makes a degree of sense given their strategic context. For the moment, the focus of the PLAN is operations close to home, and so the PLA has been able to build up a significant arsenal of long-range anti-ship hypersonic weapons which can fire from ground launchers. Those are cheaper, easier to conceal and disperse, and allow Chinese warships the luxury of focusing more on carrying missiles that are more central to their mission. The US also has an option for doing this, the Dark Eagle hypersonic launcher, but for the moment, the US Navy seems very interested in being able to carry its own missiles rather than having to dial the Army for multi-domain fire support. A final barometer of cost comparison between the ships might be looking at their defensive options. And here the Defiant looks better than any of the other individual ships on this list, but struggles to get a decisive advantage on paper, especially when you account for the multiple hulls. A big distinguishing feature is the fact it's meant to pack those two 300 to 600 kilowatt lasers, with the only equivalent on the list being the DDGX, which was also meant to have two 600 kilowatt systems. But the core point here is that dollar for dollar, crew for crew, ton for ton, Defiant doesn't look from an investment perspective like the kind of ship you'd go all in on if your concern was maxing out on powerful sensor platforms and missile cells and maintaining a balance versus the PLAN in the Pacific. Instead, it looks like a bit of a luxury buy, a multi-purpose ship that might be useful in many other contexts. If you built a couple of them, for example, they might be useful as command ships for forces that don't have to be led by a carrier or a dedicated command ship. As strange as it is to say, they might be at home in an environment like the Red Sea coming up against an opponent like the Houthis. Compared to the other designs we've looked at, they're absolutely covered in anti-drone defences. 4 laser dazzlers, 2 high-powered lasers, 4 30mm cannon, 2 5-inch guns, jammers, a dedicated counter-UAS system, a bloody railgun, as well as very large aviation facilities for a surface combatant, and plenty of offensive options on board if you wanted to go after ground targets. So if built in small numbers, you can imagine this being an expensive but potentially useful addition to the US Navy. But critically, as best we can tell, that's not the stated intention here. And it all comes down to one critical, underreported line in the announcement. Let's be clear. Between politicians, designers and militaries, strange designs and concepts surface all the time. And often they're going to be doomed to what you might call the vaporware pathway. The idea might suck up resources, potentially significant resources, in research, development, and testing, before eventually it's decided that maybe this won't work or perhaps it's not the best idea. But while that might not be a fantastic thing for the taxpayer, usually more conventional development and production programs are going to be rolling along in the background. When the Germans were looking at ideas for super heavy tanks during World War II, they didn't stop manufacturing mediums or regular heavies. When the United States was playing around with airborne lasers, the YAL-1, the US military didn't stop all its other conventional missile and air defense efforts focused on, missiles. But for the new battleship, things might be different, which is where that one line comes in. According to the release on the right there, the relationship between the new battleship and the next generation destroyer isn't so much an and relationship, it's an or. Quote, the new Trump-class battleships will replace the Navy's previous plans to develop a new class of destroyer, the DDGX. However, the Sea Service intends to incorporate the capabilities it had planned to employ on that platform into the new Trump-class ships. End quote. In other words, if we take that as given, the rise of BBG-1 is also meant to be the death of DDGX. There will be no next-generation 15,000-ton destroyer. Instead, all of the development ships are going in on a 35,000-ton guided missile battleship. And if we pivot over to this release here, you can see confirmation again that the way the Navy views its future surface combatant mix has changed dramatically from what we imagined only 6 months ago. If you look at what the People's Liberation Army Navy is building right now, you'll find at least 3 main types of surface combatant. The large Type 55 destroyer, which is basically a missile cruiser by any other name, the Type 52 destroyer, and the Type 54B frigate. So a large missile air defense ship, a multi-mission missile-armed destroyer, and then a small missile-armed surface combatant frigate. 6 months ago, we thought we knew what in the future US Navy the equivalents to each of those Chinese ships were going to be. The top of the high-low mix would be the new DDGX next-generation destroyer, the mid-tier the Burke, and then on the low end, you'd have the new missile-armed Constellation-class frigate, which would fill a massive gap in the US Navy roster by providing them an ASW frigate that also had the missiles and sensors necessary to deal with air and surface targets as well. If you assumed the US ships were going to be delivered to the spec that had been described and put them up against their Chinese equivalent, the American ships generally came out of those comparisons looking fairly good on a ship-for-ship basis. But with this latest series of announcements, the new future force is starting to look a bit different. Quote, the Navy will continue to build and employ DDG-51, aka the Arleigh Burke class, as its fleet workhorse and develop the FFX as a highly producible combatant growing the fleet rapidly through a more intentional, high-low mix of capability and platforms, end quote. FFX, by the way, without getting sidetracked too far, is a plan to build a new set of frigates for the US Navy by essentially taking the US Coast Guard Legend-class cutter and adapting it a bit for naval service, critically not including adding vertical launch missile systems. Instead, at least for the first flight of vessels, you're basically going to be back to what the US already had on its littoral combat ships. A small main gun, some self-defend capability, and whatever containerized missiles or munitions you can bolt to the thing or stick on the flight deck. When we talked about the Constellation being cancelled, I described DDGX as potentially now a no-fail program for the US Navy. But apparently failure may now very much be an option, and the new plan is to continue building Berks without a next-generation replacement, pump out a lower-spec frigate than the Constellation, and then fill in the gap at the top end of the capability spectrum by introducing the battleships alongside the Berks, making your new ship mix for the US into the middle of this century and beyond, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, still an adapted Coast Guard frigate, and a 35,000-ton guided missile battleship, assuming the US is successfully able to design and field it. On a ship-to-ship comparison, it's hard to argue the People's Liberation Army Navy isn't now ahead when it comes to the frigate game. The Navy version of the Legend FFX doesn't exist yet. Will presumably keep its 57mm main gun, but perhaps be able to carry containerized weapons of some kind. The Chinese Type 54B, by comparison, already exists, has a 100mm main gun, missile and gun close-in weapon systems, has 8 anti-ship missiles in box launchers for engaging surface targets, and a 32-cell VLS. Oh, and did I mention they already exist and are in active production? Yes, there is more to a combat vessel than just its armament, but it still looks awfully like the US is planning to introduce a new combat vessel after its competitor with significantly less combat power than its competitor. The situation comparing the Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes to the Type 52D is much more in the US Navy's favour, in part because the Burke is both larger and just generally a good design. But if you go to the top of the batting order, especially with the potential deletion of DDGX, the US hopes would now be hinging on between 20 and 25 of the new guided missile battleships. On paper, if we're just focused on weapons, the new Defiant would have an advantage over the Type 55 in a direct slugging match. The 55 doesn't have many of those nice-to-haves, like the large aviation facilities, the high-powered lasers, or that forward-mounted railgun. But, as you saw in that earlier comparison, ton for ton and dollar for dollar, they're going to be packing a lot more missile cells and have the advantage of already being in the active production and service phase. Whatever the performance of the system, in combat, an actual ship is probably going to outperform a piece of CGI concept art, which starts to get us into the future fleet implications of what might happen if the US goes ahead with the plan to cancel DDGX and instead put all of its eggs in the Defiant-sized basket. For one, you're almost certainly looking at a development delay at a time where the US Navy arguably can't afford it. DDGX may not be that far along in terms of development, but it has been running for a couple of years and could presumably employ destroyer-sized shipyards. The battleship would essentially be something very new. You'd have to start a lot of the aspects of the design from scratch, and all your industrial planning about where and how to potentially build the things is going to look very different. DDGX was going to be roughly the displacement of Zumwalt, and the US has proven, despite the cancellations and the cost overruns, that it can build ships the size of Zumwalt in its destroyer yards. Something with the length and beam of an Iowa, a little bit of a different question. The challenge with any delay like that is that after sequential cancellations and program issues, the US Navy is now arguably pretty much out of time. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers and the huge number of missile launch cells they represent are all due to be retired by 2030. The US Navy's SSGNs, those converted Ohio submarines with more than 120 Tomahawks each, those are also on the way out. There is a massive gap in terms of surface combatants and missile launch capacity across the fleet. Kind of like a forced design car crash playing out in slow motion, decision makers have clearly been aware that they're about to run into a wall, but have sequentially apparently been able to do nothing about it besides repeatedly make the situation worse. This is a chart put out by the CSIS in 2024 showing the change in ratio of VLS cells in the US Navy and PLAN over time. It showed that in 2023, the US had a more than 2-to-1 advantage in cells, 9,900 to roughly 4,200. But that marked a slight decline from the ratio 10 years earlier of about 14-to-1, and it projected that by 2034, the balance would have shifted to 3-to-1 in China's favour. Since that chart was produced, the US has cancelled its VLS-equipped frigate program, and is now apparently talking about pinning its future large surface combatant hopes on a ship that has a fraction of the missile carrying capacity per ton as its Chinese competitors. As long as you assume that achieving missile saturation is a critical part of future naval warfare, The only conclusion here is the US Navy isn't in a position to afford luxury purchases. It needs additional lethality as affordably and quickly as it can get it, and the economics say that's not going to be with a multi-mission 35,000 tonner. You'll remember the GAO report on the Zumwalt warned that one of the great risks associated with the program and one of the lessons taken from it were the dangers of relying on too many technologies that haven't yet been developed when you're pitching or relying on a new design. When that happened to the Zumwalt, the US still arguably had time on its side. But with the PLAN now cranking out the ships, you'd have to argue Washington can't afford another delay or another cancellation. But let's assume for a moment that all the technology meant to go into the Defiant concept works as intended and is available when intended. Trying to squeeze in a new multi-mission battleship still has the potential to take a financial and industrial crowbar to a US shipbuilding sector and budget that's currently held together with duct tape, legacy, and more than a few hopes and prayers. Because as recently as earlier this year, we had a future plan from the US Navy stretching out 30 years. It notably included the DDGX, but not BBG-1. For reference, I've got an extract of the shipbuilding plan from a Congressional Budget Office report on the right there, showing essentially the US Navy's blueprint on how it wanted to rebuild itself as a force over the next 3 decades. How exactly the existence of the new battleship would change that plan depends very much on what you choose to hold constant. Are we building the same rough number of ships but dialing up the cost? Or are we building the same rough number of tons but fewer ships? You get the idea. And here, even if we leave aside the challenge of what shipyards can build a battleship as opposed to a large destroyer in the United States, switching from DDGX over to Defiance is going to blow a 16-inch hole in the side of this plan. For example, the existing plan says that over the next 30 years, the United States Navy was going to build about 28 examples of the DDGX. Let's say that those 28 advanced destroyers are cancelled and replaced by 25 of these new battleships. Even if we assume no additional investment is required in shipyard capacity, the cost per ship difference is still significant. Earlier we used the CBO estimate of about $4.6 billion per DDGX, which is higher than the US Navy's estimate, against the CSIS costing a Defiant-type ship at about $9.1 billion plus. If you take those numbers, you're talking about replacing about $123 billion worth of next-gen destroyers over 30 years, with about $228 billion worth of multi-mission battleships. That would mean the shipbuilding budget would need to find about $3.3 billion extra per year in order to build fewer ships. And let's just say for a moment you say, hey Perun, we'll find the money, the ships are worth building. There are two issues with that. The first is that's not how trade-offs work. A fairer comparison, if you can find the money to build the battleships instead, would be to compare them not against the base case scenario where you're just building DDGX, but what you'd do if you use that money on something else instead. If you have that money, are the battleships so much better that you'd rather buy them instead of the laundry list of current US Navy priorities that are currently being cut or have already been cut? At the moment, the US Navy is a carrier-led force that has seen multiple proposals to effectively shelve its next-generation carrier fighter, at a point where the PLA is pushing ahead with a variety of 6th-generation programs of its own. Would you rather upgrade your destroyers to battleships or have thousands of additional missiles in inventory per year? Upgrade to the battleship or build additional attack submarines? Upgrade to the battleship or build even more destroyers? Upgrade to the battleships or outfit the US Navy with entire new families, billions of dollars worth of surface, subsurface, and aerial drones. You get the idea. You could argue the budget to build these things isn't currently there, and if it was, it would be better spent on something else. And even if the US did have the money to allocate to this program, we can ask what that might mean for the legacy part of the force, and on the industrial side, whether or not the US shipbuilding sector would actually be able to build them. According to the CRS, the Navy's 381 ship force goal, released in June 2023, called for maintaining a force of 87 large surface combatants, so currently destroyers. If you assume the Navy will eventually build the maximum 25 Defiants, but no DDX or equivalent, that would mean that even after all those battleships were finished, you'd need to keep 62 Arleigh Burkes in service just to make up the target number. That figure is very similar to the one we come up with if we focus instead on tonnage built. That plan calls for the US to build roughly 22,000 tons of large surface combatant per year, 23 Burkes and 28 DDGX at an implied rate of 1.7 ships per year over the course of 30 years. Take all of that tonnage and convert it into building battleships instead. You're now not building 1.7 ships per year, you're building closer to 60% of one. That would mean a 30-year output of roughly 18 to 19 ships rather than 51, meaning either you're going to have to allow the size of the fleet to fall, or keep 68 Burkes in service, to the point where DDG-81, the Winston Churchill, commissioned back in 2001, would still be serving in the 2050s at more than 50 years old. And critically, that's if we still give credit to all of the Burkes that have currently been authorised for construction, but not yet built or commissioned. I'm not counting them towards the 26,000 tonne a year target from 2025, I'm just allowing them to magically be added to the force as optional extras. Remove those ships, and you're either going to have to reduce the overall size of the fleet, cut down on the battleships, or reach even further back into the inventory and retain some Burkes that were first commissioned in the 1990s, basically turning the Arleigh Burke into the B-52 of the ocean even more than it already is. We're told, of course, the plan is to continue building the Burkes and the battleships in parallel, but if you do that, you have even less tonnage capacity left over for Defiant and its kin. If you keep the Burkes and only convert the 28 hypothetical DDGX builds, you end up with only about 12 battleships after 30 years. If you decide that maybe fielding 60-year-old ships doesn't scream naval superpower, you'd instead just need to build more vessels. If we want to keep the hull count constant with the 2025 shipbuilding plan, let's instead update it to 25 Defiants and 26 Burkes. That dials up the total LSC shipbuilding target to 1.135 million tonnes over 30 years, roughly 38,000 tonnes per annum as compared to the original 22,000. So yeah, you can keep up the rate of building 1.7 hulls per year and still build the battleships, but only by building so much additional tonnage that someone's inevitably going to ask, why are you not just building an extra destroyer every year instead? Arguably, DDGX would already be a significant stretch for the US shipbuilding sector, but perhaps a necessary one. At least if you assume the Burke has to be replaced eventually. In order just to hit the shipbuilding goal as it was when the destroyer was the focus, the US was still going to have to find a lot more funding and a lot more skilled labour. By the CBO estimates, the US would need to dial up shipbuilding budgets by about 50% compared to the last 5 years just to make the target as it stands. And ripping out an ambitious 15,000 tonner to replace it with an even more ambitious 35,000 tonner arguably risk taking the entire effort and levelling it up from merely ambitious to, at best, industrially dubious. And even if it worked, there's an argument the entire affair would be playing into the strengths of the US Navy's main competitors. When it comes to countering the US Navy, Beijing has put a lot of focus on at least two areas. The ability to kill large surface combatants, like aircraft carriers using things like hypersonic glide vehicles and anti-ship ballistic missiles, and competing with the US when it comes to VLS count. Partly to counter that, the US Navy has invested in a vision of more distributed firepower, while at the same time dialing up the total amount of firepower. Defiant would arguably be a shift in the other direction. Switching to it over DDGX while keeping budgets constant would result in a force with fewer overall launch cells, concentrated in fewer, larger platforms. And it's here that I suspect that even if the design never goes anywhere, the strategic implications of it might still be felt. Because there's a risk that if over the next couple of years resources originally slated for the next-gen destroyer are directed towards the battleship instead, a US Navy that desperately needs more VLS cells and more large surface combatants right now might be left waiting even longer for something to finally succeed the Burke. But you know what? Let's flip this around for a moment, because I do think there's a subtle difference between critiquing this particular concept of a modern battleship and the idea of one just in general. And so I thought it'd be worthwhile to ask the question, if you ever were to go design a battleship that might be worth bringing back in a modern context, what might that look like? Now remember, my background's in the easy part of the job here, which is writing the requirement, and then making it someone else's task to actually design the thing. But if we're going to come up with a workable thesis about why you might bring the battleship back and how, we need to remember the basics, why you got rid of them in the first place, and what they could potentially do for you. At the risk of oversimplifying, the reason nations went big with previous generations of battleship is because there was an advantage to doing so. You got more armour and you got more firepower, and the advantage of having those things was worth the effort of building larger and larger hulls that required more crew and larger, more specialised dockyards. It was a firepower and protection arms race, just as you might see with something like tank design. What navies often wanted for many, many years was for their next generation of battleship to have a gun big enough and high performance enough to punch through the armour of the other guy's battleship, while at the same time having enough armour protection itself to shrug off at least the worst of the shells that would come back. That didn't mean being able to bounce the shells off the entire superstructure of the ship, but you at least wanted to be able to do things like stop the other guy's round getting into your primary magazine, see the all-or-nothing armour scheme. So for our new generation battleship, from a requirements perspective, we have at least two major problems. The first is the vulnerability problem that helped kill them in the first place probably isn't going anywhere. Anti-ship missiles aren't just still a threat, they've become even more so. You have the development of hypersonics, anti-ship ballistic missiles, coupled with the fact that in future you might be up against opponents with credible Navy aviation or a submarine force equipped with modern torpedoes. But as we've seen with so many other systems, vulnerability itself is not necessarily a decisive factor. Usefulness is, relative to that vulnerability. Aircraft carriers may be vulnerable to hypersonics and anti-ship ballistic missiles, but they're so useful that countries like the US and China are going to continue building them. France also just announced they're going ahead with their new next-generation nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And the reason you might do that is because carrying a chunk of sovereign territory anywhere in the world and being able to project a bunch of air power from it is still so useful that you're willing to wear that vulnerability and cost. So while addressing vulnerability might be helpful in our future battleship design, we really have to solve the purpose problem more. So basically, the fundamental problem we want to answer here is why would we build a big surface combatant when we could build a small or medium one instead? What is the advantage of making a big expensive monster that requires specialised dockyards and might draw a bunch of opposing fire and still be relatively vulnerable, compared to instead building 2 or 3 ships that we can send on different missions that might be more distributed, more survivable, and use that capability that way? Here, I'm going to give 2 hypothetical answers, the lazy one and a more complex one. The lazy one is you basically just embrace an arsenal ship concept and go even bigger. The US has investigated this concept many times, including with some concepts of the cancelled CGX program, while some other countries, specifically looking at Republic of Korea, are more or less going ahead with it, albeit not on battleship scale. Korean firms have shown off concepts for what they've called the Joint Strike Ship concept. These would be capable of carrying much larger missiles than your conventional missile-armed destroyer, but despite being able to carry ballistic missiles, these things are much closer in size to a destroyer than a battleship. For their eternal face-off with the North, the South Koreans want a bunch of strategic missile firepower, but at the same time don't have to worry too much about the North's ability to attack shipping. So it's more cost-effective for them to take a bunch of ballistic missiles and put them onto a surface ship, rather than a more conventional option like a ballistic missile submarine. So, yeah, if we wanted to make a battleship-sized combatant that was potentially very useful, we just take something the size of a battleship, slap hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of missile cells on it, probably not Mark 41 specifically, those would run into problems with that sort of large-scale employment potentially, but you get the basic idea, with 2 key problems. We still might have serious trouble getting funding though, because realistically, you probably don't need an Iowa-sized platform in order to do it. The Korean ballistic missile concepts are easily in that destroyer to large cruiser range. The German Navy is planning comparatively tiny, very cheap VLS-carrying drone boats to augment the firepower of its manned principal surface combatants that exploit the fact that really, if you get down to it, if you don't need the ship to be carrying all the sensors, the crew, the support services, etc., it doesn't take that much room in order to fit a pack of Mark 41s. Oh, and then there's the People's Liberation Army Navy, which recently showed off the concept of putting containerized missile launchers, CIISS, radar, all on basically a converted medium container ship. What you're looking at there is basically 60 launch cells, some basic close defenses and sensors, all bolted onto something that is essentially as far as it is possible to be from a purpose-built battleship. Now, to be fair, that might be more useful as an expedient solution or as something concealable. Once you start talking about arsenal ship concepts that might mount hundreds and hundreds of launch cells with the associated missiles, the cost of those missiles and the cells becomes so great relative to the cost of the hull that you really don't save that much by just making it a civilian-built vessel. You may as well make it a little faster, more survivable military spec, so you can get the best possible use and also the best survivability out of those very expensive packs of missiles. But the core point here is that while you could make a battleship-sized hull exploit that arsenal ship concept, you don't need to. So for a less lazy option for a future battleship design, we need to look for the kinds of utility that only that larger hull could readily provide. And if we cut this back to the very basics, what a big ship can potentially give you is at least 3 things, all of which are intrinsically tied to your ability to fit valuable systems and equipment onto your hull. Electrical power generation, cooling capacity, and then volume and reserve buoyancy. So basically, power, the ability to use all that power, and then space to fit shit. So that hopefully you don't end up like the designers of the Constellation class having to play constantly changing design Tetris in order to keep the weight in the right place while still fitting everything you've been told to fit. Power generation is a good one to focus on first because a lot of next generation systems are potentially extremely electricity intensive, and some of the main justifications for a lot of next generation US Navy vessels, the shift from the Nimitz to the Ford class or the shift from Arleigh Burke to DDGX, was at least in part because the older designs were maxed out on power generation and the desire for something new that would have the capacity to support more power-intensive systems. How would you potentially leverage that on a battleship-sized hull then? Well, it potentially starts with a power plant. Sure, you could go combined gas-diesel if you're happy with your ship having a very codependent relationship with the following tankers, but when you start getting to larger ship designs, you have more options. You could go nuclear. Embrace that good old Cold War Soviet and US-style ship design approach of the nuclear-powered heavy cruiser and give your new vessel a way of generating a lot of electrical power without constantly draining its fuel bunkers. The US Navy has already proven this is something they are capable of doing. Now, sure, a carrier is considerably larger than the battleship we're talking about here, and at 100,000 tonnes, significantly higher displacement. But a lot of the volume and size of a carrier is dictated by the needs of the flight deck, the need to have the aircraft on board, the fuel for those aircraft, the munitions for those aircraft, and to support the massive crew required to operate the air wing. If we ditch all that, cut the crew from several thousand down to a couple of hundred, remove the hangars, remove the flight deck, then you could potentially build a large surface combatant that is considerably smaller and displaces significantly less, while still building off your existing knowledge of nuclear power plants. Your hypothetical design now probably has enough speed to keep up with the carriers and approximately infinite electrical power for whatever you want to bolt to it. So, what might that be that actually gives the ship a unique modern purpose? One place to start would be sensors. Defiant is essentially meant to mount the same SPY-6 that you see on the Arleigh Burke Flight 3. But if you've got a huge amount of volume and power available, why not consider integrating something that'll give the entire battle group much greater situational awareness? Perhaps something that can detect and discriminate from further distances, better suited for hypersonic or ballistic threats, or even with some counter-space capability. The concept for doing something like this already exists. The piece you can see on the right there from the Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance talks about taking a San Antonio amphib and basically converting it into a souped-up ballistic missile defense ship. The idea was to roughly double the radar coverage of the Advanced Missile Defense Radar planned for the Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes. The San Antonio class actually displaces significantly less than our hypothetical battleship, and it doesn't have a nuclear power plant on board. So if you had that extra volume and power to play with, I imagine the designers would come up with some pretty spicy sensor options to fit to the thing. You strap on the most powerful rig you can, and then pump so much power through it that you could cook a bag of popcorn in low Earth orbit. Then, since you have all that electrical power and a better sensor picture, you probably want to talk directed energy weapons next. Sure, the Defiant is meant to mount 2 to 3 300 to 600 kilowatt lasers plus 4 Odin Dazzlers, but that's the kind of thing the US was intending to fit on the conventional DDGX anyway. The Odin Dazzlers are just that, basically Dazzlers. And while 300 to 600 kilowatts is fairly chunky by current service standards, if you're talking about a ship that might be in service through the 2060s or even 2070s, I'd want to think bigger. At that output, you're still mostly talking a ship defense weapon. There's an Australian company, for example, advertising a 150 kilowatt system, basically for short-range anti-drone defense. If that's all you want, you can argue you don't need a nuclear-powered battleship-sized platform. If, however, you want to future-proof the design by thinking more about fleet defense lasers rather than ship defense ones, then maybe you can find a use case here. Depending on how the technology evolves, maybe you get to the point where you can mount an electrical laser in the megawatt range onto a large ship, turning it into a potential anti-aircraft weapon, anti-missile weapon, potentially counter-space dazzler or ballistic missile defense system. Note there's a lot of potentials and ifs sneaking into the description here, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. But for now, let's get to the railguns. If you can solve issues like the material science challenge of barrel life on these sort of hypervelocity railguns, there is potential here. The Japanese clearly see it, including as a missile defense weapon as well as a long-range artillery system, and I can't see any reason why a hypothetical battleship design with a lot of power to play with couldn't potentially mount these systems. One possibility is using them for shore bombardment, obviously, although I'm not sure the economic case has really been made there against missile systems. But we're potentially adding here yet another next-generation, fleet-scale anti-hypersonic defense system. The Defiant design calls for a 32 megajoule gun. I see no reason that a nuclear-powered ship the size of Defiant wouldn't be capable of furnishing that, potentially to multiple guns, or scaling up to even higher power levels. And why would you potentially do that rather than just strapping more and more missiles to the thing? Because you can put the missiles on other ships. Almost any large surface combatant is going to have the space and capacity to pack a VLS full of missiles. Heck, small surface combatants can carry VLS, and in the future, I'd expect small drone platforms to be capable of doing the same. So you don't really need the definition of a gold-plated solution in order to focus on dialing up your missile count, as long as you remember to still build all those other more affordable things. But not every large surface combatant is going to have the power, cooling, and volume needed to make the best out of a potential railgun armament. So if all the underlying technical challenges could be solved, maybe you integrate some of this into your design. So if you put all that together by trying to differentiate our future battleship design from what other ships in the fleet can already do, and in some cases already do markedly more efficiently, we've ended up with something that is not a traditional battleship, and in no way a substitute for traditional destroyers or frigates. It's not there to pack an enormous amount of conventional artillery. Instead, what we've essentially built is a command, fleet, air, and ballistic missile defense platform, something which should have room for massive flag facilities, enormous sensors which improve the awareness of the fleet, and unique systems like fleet area defense lasers, hypersonic railguns, maybe microwave defense systems, which you could use to potentially augment the other more traditional air defense weapons already available to the fleet: SM-2, SM-6, SM-3, etc. This is not a 21st century Iowa, it's a fast-moving nuclear-powered radar station, which also has the capacity to generate some very high-power, militarized disco laser shows. Would that be aesthetically pleasing? Who knows? Would it be more cost-efficient or effective than other equivalent platforms that already exist? Probably not. And if someone proposed that design tomorrow, I'd expect most or all navies to look at it and probably not fund it. But I think it's illustrative of how you might take a concept like the large surface combatant in the 21st century and try and figure out a way to make something that size useful without just turning it into an extra large destroyer or a small carrier. A lot of the technology you'd need to make that kind of ship useful doesn't really exist yet. The high-powered lasers, the material science for the railguns. And so at the absolute best, that kind of future battleship concept isn't something you'd start building in 2030, it's something you might start looking at in the mid-2030s, with the advantage of additional research, technological development, and time to refine the concept and figure out how it would fit into a future surface fleet. In any case, the point of that exercise isn't to suggest you start building those kind of ships tomorrow. It's to demonstrate that I think it's premature to permanently rule out the concept of the battleship coming back forever. Just that if it does, it might not look like this battleship or this one. In conclusion then, what does the announcement of the Defiant mean for the future of the US Navy and US military shipbuilding? In the short run at least, not much. Because while the White House and Navy leadership can announce their intention to create a new type of ship or to cancel an existing program, that's not really how the US procurement system works. Congress are the ones that hold the purse strings. They're the ones that can authorize programs, and as we've seen from things like the A-10 retirement saga, they can also prevent programs from ending. As of the most recent budget documents, DDGX was still the future large surface combatant in there, actively receiving development funding, while we haven't yet seen a public line item for BBG-1. It's possible there might be a push to strip the funding away from the next generation destroyer, redirect it towards the battleship, or appropriate more funds in that direction, but that might get really difficult if Congress doesn't want to play ball. And in a very polarised US Congress, I'm not sure how well you're going to do building a bipartisan consensus around turfing out the Arleigh Burke replacement to build something named after the current president. However the politics and budget battles ultimately shake out though, for US shipbuilding and industrial and fleet planning, there's probably a rocky road ahead. If you were a potential supplier or yard considering making future investments in the anticipation that DDGX would ultimately be coming along, maybe now you're holding off. Alternatively, if you might be excited to jump onto the potential possibilities that the Defiant class might raise, again, until things are settled, you might want to hold off. The risk here is that you potentially end up with developmental, budget, and planning paralysis. You don't actually design and build the battleship, but you don't carry on designing and building the next generation destroyer either. Also, you don't end up designing or building anything else new either, because everyone knows the guided missile battleships are meant to be very expensive, and the Columbia class was already feasting on the available budget, meaning the US Navy is potentially stuck just continuing to print out Arleigh Burkes one after another, until eventually the dust settles and enough time passes to finally come up with a definitive plan. The problem though, if you're the United States, locked in a shipbuilding industrial battle with the world's greatest shipbuilding power, is that while you're faffing around, they might be pressing print on the Type 55s, Type 52s, and Type 54s they're going to be facing off against you in the Pacific. If nothing else, the Defiant concept demonstrates that there's no shortage of ambition or imagination in American circles. Time and shipyard capacity, though, those are in much shorter supply. And okay, channel update to close out. As I said, I hadn't intended to go back to US military shipbuilding in 2025, but when someone announces that battleships are making a comeback, I thought it was worth a quick pivot. The point I was trying to get at here, even though we're still very much in the concept phase of a ship like this, is that it's probably not impossible to build a large surface combatant this size, and in part because of that size, whatever you came up with wouldn't be useless. In fact, on a ship-for-ship basis, it would probably be a decent match for just about anything else out there. Instead, the point is that it's likely to be a very expensive luxury product. And given a context of strategic time pressure, budgetary and shipbuilding constraints, while there might eventually be a time for a battleship-sized combatant to make a comeback, I think there's a decent case to make that it isn't this time. Now, I'll have a bit of a summary of sorts for the channel over the course of 2025 in the next week or two, but for the moment, let me just leave it with this. Thank you very much to all of you who've supported and engaged with the channel throughout this year. All the best for your New Year's celebrations. I think you have to admit that if nothing else, 2025 has been a very eventful year. So if anything, let's hope that 2026 turns out to be a bit better and perhaps a tad less interesting. Cheers to all of you, especially those of you who jumped over to the Terra Invicta run on the gaming channel. And with any luck, I'll see you all again next year.